نورا للعالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. We've been looking at the issue of expiation for missed prayers and missed fasts, and that every missed obligatory fast textually requires a fidya. And by explicit text of the Quran, and the same requirement is understood, is implied textually according to the Hanafis, and is established by a fortiori reasoning by dilalat al-nas, because if you have to expiate for the fast, then a fortiori you would expiate for the prayer, which is more incumbent, and you'll be asked about it first. And we saw even some of the hadiths about missed prayers indicate that the same thing would apply. Anyway, so in the Hanafi school, someone dies, they're supposed to set aside their up to 1/3 of their bequest for clearing their debts to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, debts to human beings come before any talk of your wasiyya, etc. If your debts to human beings take up all your inheritance, then it took up all your inheritance. Right? Why? Because the rights of those living people were attached to your dhimma before the inheritors, right? So that comes up when we look at inheritance and so on. So what if someone dies and they have a lot of prayers and a lot of fasts to make up, and what they left behind, so in their bequest they had $10,000 was 1/3 of their estate, and the total fidya, the total expiatory payments due for their missed fasts and prayer comes up to 30,000. Then there is so what does one do there? Right? One needs to appreciate that the law has a meaning and it has a form. Right? A meaning and a purpose, but also has a form. In general, the point is the meaning and purpose, but the form is to be respected and upheld to the extent possible. And you can take a day-to-day example and think Canada, don't think Pakistan. Right? What is the purpose of traffic lights? What's the purpose of traffic lights? To regulate traffic. Just to regulate traffic for the sake of it? No. Ultimately, it goes back to all matters of human interest. It goes back to prevention of harm and facilitation of benefit, right? Prevention of accidents, etc., and facilitating the flow of traffic. Because if everyone tries to go at the same time at an intersection, then benefit is prevented. And it wards off disputes as well, etc. Right? There's so much. Driving in Canada is so much more boring than somewhere like Karachi or Lahore or Cairo. Right? Because how many arguments are taking place on a daily basis at intersections? Hardly. Right? When the last time you stuck your finger out and pointed at someone? Right? Anyways. So now, if you're in the countryside and you come to a traffic light in the prairies, in all 4 directions is no traffic. You're running late. is the traffic light right there fulfilling any immediate purpose of the purposes of regulating traffic? There's no traffic, it's only you. And you can see in all four directions, right? There's no car, nor pedestrian, nor animal around. Light is red. So the meaning and purpose of the traffic light is not being fulfilled. Are you allowed to just ignore the traffic light? No. Why? Because if you do not observe the form of the law, the meaning and purpose is lost. Right? It's lost. Unless there's of course, we have to take out, in any model, you have to take out the exceptional circumstances that are understood to have exceptional rules, right? That you have a dying passenger or something like that. But personal interests cannot be said, doesn't make sense to me. Okay, doesn't make sense to you. But next time someone comes to a traffic light, they don't think somebody was there, they proceeded, but they ignored looking at one of the sides, and they trampled on, they drove over somebody. So, here, Shar'an, let's say the fidya amounts to 30,000. You're only able to pay, you only set aside 10,000 to be paid. Now, inform how much fidya, how much expiation, how much in expiatory payments are you ultimately going to be able to give to a poor person to benefit from? 10,000. You can't turn 10,000 into 30,000. But 30,000 was due. That's the legal debt that you had, owed ultimately to the most merciful. So what's called hilatu tamlik, the legal mechanism. Some people translate hila as a trick, but it's not. A trick has negative connotations, right? A trick is like trying to subvert the system. I tricked him. You have to be very careful in English too of usage, and that's why the writing commitments, they're very important, because a lot of times people are reading balagha in Arabic, and are you going to be doing a lot of teaching in Arabic down the road? Maybe you want to move to Mauritania or somewhere, but most people who are in English-speaking countries will be using English more than Arabic, and you have to pay attention to your your English language, right? There's a big difference between a trick and you can call it a legal device, a legal mechanism, a legal process, right? Right? So it's a hila, right? In which you are ultimately paying what you have, which is 10,000, but it's called hilatu tamlik, by this legal mechanism for repeated transfer of ownership. In the end, you have paid $10,000, but you done it 3 times properly, so that you have ostensibly cleared the 30,000 that was due upon you. And it's hoped that through this act, observed with the right attitude and soundly, it's hoped that Allah overlook, and we do the fidya raja'an. We do the fidya out of hope that Allah accept. Right? So it's an admission that we're doing oh Lord, we're doing the best that we can. Right? It's not done. Now, in general, the hila in the Sharia, like a legal loophole or a legal mechanism, it is the hila is considered a means, and it takes the ruling of what is its consequent result. So the hila that is impermissible is when you do some legally sound steps to circumvent an obligation in its meaning, or where you end up doing something in a manner that does not fulfill its maqsid, its purpose. How? For example, in zakat. Wealthy trader owes $50,000 in zakat. So he goes to Zubair, says, Zubair, would you like me to give you $200? Zubair's really poor. I'd love to. I said, okay. I'm going to give you this envelope. And it's yours. But you agree to these steps and you give it back to me afterwards. So you set it up. The person gave their zakat and the poor person gave it back. And you gave him a payment for doing that. That's a hila of zakat. You gave it to a poor person, you took it back. How much did you give your zakat to a poor person? Did you? Yes. But then he gave it back to you. So did you end up, so in form you gave it, but in meaning, did it get to a poor person? No. That kind of hila is madhmuma jiddan, is highly blameworthy. In itself, it's makruh tahriman as an act, but plus it has the sin of you're trying to trick Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَا يَخْدَعُونَ إِلَّا أَنفُسَهُمْ. And they're only tricking themselves. Right? And it's very blameworthy. Right? And a type of scholar who's banned, who's supposed to be banned, is من يعلم الناس الحيل الباطلة. Someone who teaches people false legal tricks. But there are situations where a hila does not circumvent the legal purpose of the act. It's an expression of doing the best one can. Right? An example would be that, let's say that due to the current economic crisis, Zubaydah would not be able to make rent on her prayer bead shop called the Blessed Bead, right? So she opened a little store called the Blessed Bead. But she said it'll be an immersive experience. So you go in person and you make the beads there, and you know they had a way, there's a string, you put the beads in, and but now would people want to go and handle beads other people have handled in the current crisis, etc.? So she doesn't have money to pay rent. The landlord is a tough guy. His name is also Zayn, but he is Zayn the tough. We have Zayn the soft and Zayn the tough. So Zayn the tough, I'll give you 1 month. Afterwards, I'm going to kick you out so hard on the street that there'll be a hole in the street. Oh. So now she doesn't have the money. She could go and borrow money from the bank as a through riba. Right? Is there a problem with that? Is there a problem with that? Yes, it's a major sin. It's riba. Right? Right? So, Zubaydah doesn't know what to do. She goes to Zayn the Soft. Zayn the Soft, how do I deal with Zayn the Hard? He says, Yani Maulana Zayn Lutfi Zada. Okay? Right? Because he has a lot of lutf, so they call him Lutfi Zada. Right? So Maulana Lutfi Zada says that, look, what you can do is I can find this businessman and you set things up. So let's say the rent was $2,000, right? And we'll do this way, where you are paying him $2,500 and he'll clear your loan. And one of these hilas, one of these ways of doing that is called tawarruq. Right? One of the, and you can read a little bit about it. Mufti Taqi has, and there's a standard for tawarruq. Now, when used in an exceptional situation, this observes the form of the Sharia, right? In that you are not at any stage doing something haram. That hila is less bad in exceptional circumstances than outright riba. Right? So hilas take the ruling of the circumstance. Right? But you can't go and give yourself fatwa on these. These are very delicate situations. These are sort of legal surgery, right? That these are sensitive scenarios that the fuqaha deal with a variety of considerations, right? Generally, if, these kinds of legal tricks in exceptional situations are kept exceptional. When they become the norm, then they're not necessarily much better than the actual haram act. So it needs, and distinguishing between what's a hila, what's a legal mechanism, and an authentic shari'i alternative can sometimes be subtle to the untrained or uneducated eye. Like, what is the difference between Sharia compliant financing and just a conventional mortgage, right? For example. And there are substantial differences, right? And the onus is on the person who doesn't know. So this is important to appreciate, because what we're looking at is an example of a hila. The summary of it is, you find a poor person, in the end, you give them the $10,000 in our case. But you agree, I'll give it to you once, fully. And the uqud al-tabarru' yushtaratu fiha sihhatul qabd. That because I have two types of contracts, if you remember. You have uqud al-mu'awada, you have contracts of exchange, يتحقق التمليك بها عند تمام الإيجاب والقبول, right? That in contracts of exchange, the transfer of ownership takes place when the offer and acceptance happen, right? But in non-exchange contracts, where the item of consideration is from one party, such as gifts and sadaqah is from one party as well. Okay? There's qabul from the other party, but what is the poor person giving you? Anything? No. So gifts, lending, but also charity. There's ijab and qabul, but because one party is given something without consideration, there has to be qabd for it to be complete, for the transfer of ownership to take place. There has to be actual taking of possession. There has to be completed taking of possession, actually or effectively. Okay. So let's say in this leather pouch there are $10,000 of gold coins, slightly bigger than this. So it's given to the poor person. They confirm that there's 10,000. They take possession of it, and then they gift it back, and the person gives it again to the poor person. They do this 3 times with full taking of ownership, by qabd and then gifting it back with taking of ownership, with the fulfillment of the conditions, if it's done 3 times, in the last of which it remains with the poor person, right? In our case, Zubair, then the 10,000 was paid, but we've also taken into account the surah of discharging the debt you owed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah is merciful, He'll overlook. It is to be hoped. Right? We leave that to that, oh Allah, we did the best we could. It's an expression of raja, of hope. ولم يفي ما أوصى به الميت عما عليه أو لم يكفي ثلث ماله أو لم يرضى يوصي بشيء وأراد أحد التبرع بقليل لا يكفي فحيلته لإبراء ذمة الميت عن جميع ما عليه أن يدفع ذلك المقدار اليسير تقديره يعني بعد تقديره لشيء من صيام أو صلاة أو نحوه. So if the amount that was left in the bequest is not sufficient, from the dead is not sufficient to cover what was upon them, or they said, clear my debt, but 1/3 of their estate was not sufficient to clear the debt, or they did not leave anything in their bequest, and someone, whether of the inheritors or not, whether related to them or not, decided to give a small amount, and a small amount meaning an insufficient amount. يعني بقليل لا يكفي أي التبرع بقدر لا يكفي. بقدر لا يكفي. The legal فحيلته, the legal mechanism to إبراء ذمته, to clear their dues, because this is a debt to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And Allah, wallahu ghani wa antum al-fuqara, and Allah is free of need, you're the ones in need. You can't do this with someone else's, right? To clear what's due to the deceased of all that that is upon them, أي من حقوق من هذه الحقوق, right? Of these من هذه الحقوق من حقوق الله, right? Of the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? You can't do that with what you owe people, right? Because that has to be given to them, right? If I owe Sidi Hamza $500, I can't, he comes 2 months later and say, oh, where's my $500? Oh, I gave it to a few poor people. Obviously. Or I did hilat tamliq with one poor person 20 times, I gave them 25 times, $20, and I say, okay, beta, take the $20. So I paid your 500. I gave this. I did hilat al-tamliq with this poor person, right? Okay. Its trick is that one gives that insufficient extent after defining how much is owed of expiation with respect to the fast or prayer and the like, and one gives ويعطيه للفقير بقصد إسقاط ما يرد عن الميت, and one gives it to a poor person with the intention of clearing what is due upon them. فيسقط عن الميت بقدره. So then that extent would be cleared from the deceased person. In our example, the debt, the fidya they owed, the expiatory payments they owed for missed prayers and fasts was $30,000, let's say. So one gave $10,000. When one gave it and the poor person took possession of it, 10,000 of the 30,000 is cleared. ثم بعد قبضه يهبه الفقير للولي أو للأجنبي ويقبضه أي الولي أو الأجنبي لتتم الهبة وتملك. Right? And then after the poor person took possession of it, the poor person gifts it back to the guardian or the third party, and they, the guardian or third party, take possession of it in order for the gift to be complete upon taking possession of it. Right? Because if, let's say, I realize I don't want this pen anymore, right? So I say, Sidi Hamza, I gift you this pen. And I put it back in my, in my thing. Is it yours now? No. لا يتم إلا بالقبض. Right? ثم يدفعه الموهوب له للفقير. And then the person who's carrying out this, carrying this out on behalf of the deceased, gives it a second time to the poor person. بجهة الإسقاط متبرعا به عن الميت, with the intention of clearing the dues of the deceased, giving it on behalf of the deceased. فيسقط عن الميت بقدره. And then the extent of what they gave is cleared from the deceased. Right? ثم يهبه الفقير للولي. And then the poor person gifts it back to the guardian or the third party, أو للأجنبي, ويقبضه. And then they take possession of it. ثم يدفعه الولي للفقير متبرع عن الميت وهكذا. And then the guardian or third party gives it again in the same way to the poor person on behalf of the deceased, and so on repeatedly, حتى يسقط ما كان يظنه على الميت من صلاة وصيام, until what one thought was due on behalf of the deceased of prayers and fasting is cleared. In our case, one does this 3 times with taking of possession on behalf of the one given to, and again taking possession from the one it's given, who's given it, and it points to يظنه على الميت, right? Because على is للحق, right? يعني على الميت is للحق, and الحق is الشيء الثابت, is that which is clearly affirmed. So حقوق are based on القطع, on surety. That's why Imam Shrumbulali puts the word يظنه, that they thought. What is he pointing to? That الأصل في الحقوق العلم. The basis of rights is knowledge. Is العلم يعني اليقين. But إذا تعذر اليقين يصار للظن. When certainty is not possible, one resorts to reasonable surety. Let's say the person left no indication how many prayers, how many fasts. Now you don't think ill of people, but sometimes you know your this relative, because they used to consult you, that they mention I have about 20, there's 20 years, beta, I didn't pray, whatever. So for sure they don't have 20, they have 20 years. And as a fact that there was a family gathering and they remained seated in the living room before the Maghrib prayer, and they were just seated with their back to the Qibla the whole prayer time. So you know that there's some extra, so you make an estimate without prying into their affairs. You make an estimate that, okay, you probably have about 25 years of prayer to make up, fasting, okay, from the age of 65, they weren't able to fast due to diabetes, and so you get some sense, it's okay, to be safe, you make a calculation, and dhann is sufficient, right? Without tajassus, and you also have to have sensitivity with the living, because people get it's very sensitive. Like, ask If someone just passed away and you want to mention good things, so did they used to fast all? Like you ask all these questions, so you may be trying to legally assist them, but you leave a social wreckage around you. So there are sensitive ways of dealing with these things. Discretion. Think of the right person to ask, who'd be responsible, etc. Right? That's why يظنه there is an important. And the like of them, مما ذكرناه من الواجبات, and the like of them of we mention of required duties, right? Of the Hajj and so on, that's mentioned before. وهذا هو المخلص في ذلك إن شاء الله تعالى بمنه وكرمه. And this is the way to strive to clear that debt if Allah wills, insha'Allah, if Allah wills, by His man, by His grace and His generosity. Right? So this is a way of, so we're doing this as an expression of seeking your favor and grace and so on. And it's usually best to appoint someone to discharge it on your behalf properly, but there should be a trustworthy person. Right? And just simple, ويجوز إعطاء فدية صلوات وصيام أيام ونحوها لواحد. It's permitted to give the fidya of many prayers, or for many missed prayers or many missed fasts and the like, to one person. من الفقراء جملة. Except that in general, what's the ruling? They say كره الإغناء, right? إلا عند الحاجة, right? That giving so much to one faqir that they reached the level of ghina is makruh. Why? Because there are other poor people, right? Unless there's a need, right? Such as what? That okay, they themselves they have enough, but they had upcoming needs. So you give it to somebody, but this amount will enable them to register. They have upcoming expenses, for example. So that's not actually ighna. That's not making them wealthy, because they have upcoming hawa'ij asliya. They have upcoming needs. Or they have multiple dependents in the same household, and the like. And that comes up in the chapter on zakat and the principles of giving in charity. Okay, so it's permitted in general, but you have to keep in mind the masalat al-ighna, of you don't give so much to one poor person, but there are scenarios where you could, right? The only thing is that you also have to look at, is this person hasan al-tasarruf or not? They're good in their financial dealings or not. Why? Because let's say there's a student of knowledge. And they're studying in an expensive country. You could give them in one go a whole year worth of expenses. If you do that, you give some talib ilm $25,000. They'll go and find every book that they can buy and more, right? What happens in 6 months from now? They don't have money, right? So if you don't know a person to be responsible, it's better not to do that jumlatan wahida. Okay. بخلاف كفارة اليمين. But you could, in itself, you can give it in one go, keeping the issue of ighna in mind, as opposed to kafarat al-yamin, the expiation for vows, بحيث لا يجوز أن يدفع للواحد أكثر من نصف ساعة, where it's not permitted to give one person more than نصف ساعة في يوم, of للنص, because of the text about it. على العدد فيها, for the number in it. Now you can see the rulings of the يمين in its due place. وكذا ما نص على عدده في كفارة, and likewise that which has a specific number in kafara, right? Like the kafara of zihar, for example, that comes in the chapters on marriage and divorce. والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم وهو الموفق بمنه وكرمه, and Allah knows best, and He's the one who grants facilitation by His grace and His honor. Okay. So that is the issue of fidya, and publicly a lot of people are unaware of it, but the ulama, the learned, the righteous, the pious, they practice these things. Just انتشار الجهل ليس مسقطا للأحكام الشرعية, right? The spreading of ignorance does not mean that the rulings of the Sharia get lifted, right? And some people have issues with it. That's why you don't overstate it too, right? Like is there khilaf on it? Yes. Now, do I have to teach people the Shafi'i madhab? No. This is, and at the same time, if some people get really worked up, it's useful to know that there's other opinions. Sometimes you can just go ask so-and-so. And even major ulama would do that sometimes, right? So, Sheikh Akram Abdul Wahab al-Mawsili, who's a Shafi'i faqih, but he taught the Hidayah cover to cover 4 times. He taught actually the Tawdih in Hanafi fiqh cover to cover 6, Hanafi usul 6 times. He's a Shafi'i faqih. But like a lot of the Iraqi ulama, they're people of both madhabs that study both madhabs in depth, and they teach both madhabs. But Sheikh Akram himself in his practice was very much Shafi'i. And there's others as well. Sheikh Abdul Malik al-Sa'di, who's the faqih of Iraq right now, he has excellent durus on the Hidayah that Dr. Lu'ay, his student, spreads, but he calls him huwa Shanafiyun. He's a Shafi'i Hanafi. So you see him teaching Hanafi fiqh, you think he's a solid Hanafi, but he's very much a Shafi'i. Hafidhahullah. Other madhabs exist. So once in a while, someone would ask an awkward question. Sheikh Akram would say, "Go ask Sidi Faraz. It's just down the hill." I was like, "Sheikh Akram, they went to you." Said, "Yeah, but it's easier in your madhab." Said, "You know the ruling." He said, "But one can forget details of a ruling of a madhab, but one doesn't practice oneself." That's his caution, even though he's at the mufti level, even the Hanafi madhab. So also you want to inculcate in people that that there are madhabs, we respect them all, but go to the people specialized in the madhab, in a madhab for their questions. That's much safer. So rather than give people a Shafi'i dispensation, point them to a Shafi'i scholar, give them their number, contact this person, this is they're available on WhatsApp or however, someone trustworthy, go ask them. Even if you know the answer, where it's feasible, right? There are some dispensations that even Hanafi ulama sometimes take from other madhabs, with caution, having studied them. But, so it's good to be aware. Some people have an issue with it, point them if you've... and sometimes just point them to someone more experienced in our own madhab, say, go ask so-and-so, right? Recently, a controversial issue, Sheikh Yusuf Welch, I was answering it for the answer service. He said, "So what's the answer?" I said, "Ask Sheikh Hassan." I know the answer. Actually, I asked Sheikh Hassan 22 years ago about it. Sheikh Hassan, of course, answered exactly how I was so happy how he answered 22 years ago. But it's just safer. Who wants? If he made a mistake, right? That's between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's just safer. Babu Qada al-Fawaid, the chapter on making up missed prayers. So of course this is an example of husn al-dhan, because the asl would be, because al-asl fil af'al al-qasd. Adam al-qasd is aarid, right? The basis of actions is that you assume that it was done deliberately. That's the basic assumption, right? Right? Like if someone's holding the cup, so why are they holding the cup? Why is the cup like this? I chose to. That's the initial assumption. Oh, it must have been an accident. No, the asl is that any deliberate action would be done deliberately, right? That's the asl. That's why they point out, why did they use al-fawaid, missed, and they didn't say al-matrukat. Babu qada qada al-salawat al-matruka, the left prayers. Even though that expression has come in the hadith. Man taraka al-ahdu baynana wa baynahum as-salah. The covenant between us and them is the prayer. فَمَنْ تَرَكَهَا, so whoever leaves it. So, but he says, ظَنًّا بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ خَيْرًا, thinking well of the believers. Right? That's also a big thing. Sometimes it's one of the akhta' as-salihin, one of the errors of the righteous, right? That out of their pious concern may be excusable, because there are things, at-ta'assuf ala zaman and so on, right? And many of the righteous wrote poetry of, right, regret, but making a general negative statement about the ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is an act of, it has many levels of error. Amongst them is, it's something that is distressful to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because this is his ummah, that his concern in his worldly life, in his barzakh life, and the akhirah is ummati, right? Yeah. Sayyidina Jibreel was sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell you, Ya Muhammad, inna la nukhzika fi ummatik. We will not cause you to regret regarding your ummah. We will not let you down regarding your ummah. وَلَسَوْفَ يُعْطِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَتَرْضَى. In the Quran, from the tafsir of it is, regarding, you will be pleased with what we'll give you with respect to your ummah, etc. And the Prophet warned, Man qala halaka an-nas fahuwa ahlakuhum. One sound narration, the other sound narration, fahuwa ahlakahum. Or said the people are ruined, he is the most ruined of them, or he has ruined them. Right? So that's not correct, right? Rather, the ummah, the Prophet said, ummati kal matar. My community is like the rain. La yudra awwaluha khayrun am akhiruha. It's not clear, but the first of it's good, better is good, or the end of it. There's, the khair amim. Let's see all this. Everybody is going on this neo-Ottomanist trip about Turkey, etc. Just see what Turkey's been through from the beginning of the 20th century, even in the late Ottoman period, with the intense secularizing forces that crept in, right till the end of the 20th century, the stress that Turkey was under, right? And look at it now. I'm not particularly emotional. Like, people say someone died, it's okay, rahmatullahi alayhi, like, it's okay, well, how can I help you? Like, it's hard-heartedness. But, all of that, right? And people The vast majority of Turks have held on to their deen. Forget everything else, they held on to iman. And that's the bitaqa. So that's not a, and we don't think ill of those who say, and that there's a thing to have huzn, but it's out of sense of nusх, etc. They're principles. So qada al-fawa'id is an example of that. Now, a few things. One needs to have, have clarity. That's outside the scope of the class right now. There is established consensus that obligatory prayers must be made up. It's a matter of ijma', right? That ijma' is related by the greatest authorities of our deen, right? It's mentioned by Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala in his Majmu'. It's related by al-Kamal ibn al-Humam. It's mentioned by al-Iraqi, the author, al-Wali al-Iraqi in Tarh al-Tathrib. It's related, across the board. And textually, it's also very clear, right? It textually is very clear because the command to pray entails two things: to perform the prayer and to do it within a particular time. The fact that you fail to do it within its particular time does not absolve you of the duty, right? Right? If you're told, could you please buy me a stand like this tomorrow? Let's say your father saw this on the transmission. Said, oh, that's very interesting. So he says, Hamza beta, can you buy one of these for me today? And you didn't do it today. The command to buy a bamboo book stand today contains within it two elements: the command to do this action, and number, to do it within a time. So you didn't do it today. You got caught up at Seekers, and you caught up having dinner, and then the store closed. 3 days later, uncle says, beta, what happened to the bamboo stand? Oh, I didn't get to buy it that day, so khalas, I thought there's no need to buy it anymore. Is that reasonable? Is it? Hamza beta, is it reasonable? Yes, no? You have a question? No, it's by any standard, it's not. Like in any human situation, when you're made responsible to do something and you're given a parameter, do it by this time. If you don't do it by that time, unless there's external evidence that it can only be done within that time, then you still have to do it. Anyone at work, their employer gives them, do these 10 tasks by end of day, do these 10 tasks by Wednesday. You're late on their tasks. You can't assume that you no longer have to do them unless there's external evidence that thing could only be done by then, etc. You need external evidence to establish that you're absolved of the responsibility. Right? And that goes back to understanding the nature of huquq, of rights, right? And the issue of the dhimma, of what's due upon you, and applies to everything. You borrowed, you bought, you purchased a phone, and you owe 10 payments of $100 due by the 15th of the month. So now it is, oops, I missed the payment. It's the 18th. Khalas, I don't have to make the November payment. If someone did that to you, would you accept that? No. Because the fact that you committed to pay $100 by November 15th has two works. You committed to pay $100. Number two, to do it by a certain date. And that applies to rights in general. And then there's other, so it's understood by the commands to pray in the Quran. It's also understood by multiple Sahih hadiths as well about the obligation to make up missed prayers. Amongst them, a hadith fi'liya, a hadith describing the action of the Prophet ﷺ. They, like on Laylat al-Ta'ris, the night when they traveled into the night. And then the person appointed to wake them up failed to remain awake, even though he was waiting, staying up, standing, but he fell asleep. And so, and they made up Fajr. And the Prophet ﷺ, and we see that amongst some of the Sahaba whom that occurred to. Also at the Battle of the Khandaq, they made up their prayers. And there's other evidentiary basis in that incident. That would happen ala mala' min as-Sahaba, in the presence of a large number of Sahaba. And then more strongly, the hadith al-qawliya, right, of the Prophet ﷺ. Of course, especially the Battle of the Khandaq or al-Ahzab, because this is something the Muslims did publicly. It wasn't something that happened privately amongst to a small number of people, and it's widely transmitted, right? That they, and we'll see the hadiths. But the Prophet ﷺ also said in the Sahih hadith, "Man nama an salatin aw nasiyaha," whoever sleeps through a prayer or forgets it, فَلْيَقْضِيهَا, let them make it up. إِذَا تَذَكَّرَهَا, when they remember it. That's an example of, so the expression of the text deals with, the ibarat al-nas deals with two cases: sleeping and forgetting. The dilalat al-nas, the indication of the text, deals with leaving it deliberately. Because sleeping is an excuse. So even when you had an excuse of sleeping, forgetting is an excuse. Unless unexcusable, that you regularly forget because of negligence, but that's not forgetting, that is negligence or lack of concern, but forgetting is an excuse. So when you have an excuse, you must make up the prayer. Right? Then, a fortiori, this is called bil awla. A fortiori, if you don't have an excuse and you missed a prayer, you must make it up. Because the meaning that it's affirmed is that if you are obligated to a prayer, it remains obligatory until you've discharged it. Right? Right? That's like if Umar Bhai says that, listen, if you miss the deadline because you forgot or delayed, just pay anyways. So Zubair says, I don't want to pay him today. He says, I thought I didn't have to pay because you said if I forgot or had some difficulty, then you don't mind if I pay later. But I didn't pay deliberately, so it means I don't have to pay. Does that make any sense? No. And sometimes it's just, you have to just see what our religion tells us and say in day-to-day life, would that be accepted? And nobody would accept that kind of, nobody reasonable. So across the madhahib, this is the position. And it's also the position of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. There is the narration that some people quote that it's not required to make up prayers. That is not the transmitted position of the main transmitted position of Imam Ahmad, nor is it the relied upon position of the Hanbali school, nor the fatwa position of the Hanbali school. And there, the only major khilaf till the time of Imam Nawawi was that of Ali ibn Hazm and some of the literalists, and he dismisses that as being a breach of ijma' and an expression of their legal aberrance, of their shuduz in legal method of the literalists, because they don't, they don't accept dilalat al-nas, the indication of texts. And then Ibn Taymiyyah argued the same point, but his opinion is not taken for the same reason as Ali ibn Hazm's opinion is not taken on this, because it's considered an aberrant position. And it's important to be clear about that, because there's a good discussion regarding this in Reliance of the Traveler. And those of you know Arabic, there's a wonderful work on this topic by Sheikh Nuh Ali Salman al-Qudat, which is referred to in the Reliance, and the book is published, and about Ibra'u Dhimma fil Huquq, about clearing one's dues with respect to rights, the rights of Allah and the rights of people, the basis of it and the process of it. Some of the details are according to the Shafi'i school, but it has a lot of important points, right? Okay. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, al-qada'u lughatan, what do you have?
Al-ahkam.
What edition are you using?
The Sheikh Shana edition, because he mentions in a footnote al-awla and yaqul al-hukam.
With a fatha?
No, he doesn't have any. Okay.
So that would be al-hukam. What's that? Al-hukm. Right? He's not saying that, he's quoting a Tahtawi. Right? Right? That's like if I said Joe Biden said, I won the election, if I say I won the election, right? There's a big difference, right? If I say Joe Biden said he won the election, and then someone comes, Sheikh Faraz said he won the US election. It's not true. So Sheikh Shana didn't say that. Sheikh Shana or Sheikh Sha'ar?
No.
Okay. What do you have, Omar? Al-qada' lughatan? Okay. Okay. Al-qada', so he says al-qada' lughatan, al-ahkam, it's more proper to say al-hukm, right? Because qada' is a singular meaning, right? Now of course qada' has a broad, it's a core concept in our religion, because qada' has to do with being a judge, but also it has to do with making. There's ada and qada', has many uses. There's also qada' and qadr. So it's a term whose root one needs to do well to. But qada' comes from judgment, right? It's judgment. It's a decisive affirmation. But it also, qada' also has the sense of to clear something fully. Right? Right? Because qada' is min al-qata', is to cut something. Right? So when you need qada' is when you did something, you cut off what was due from you. Right? So al-qada' wa shari'atan إسقاط الواجب بمثل ما عنده. Right? So he says the Shar'i meaning of qada is to clear the duty with the like of what was due. Right? Right? So this is one definition. Many use this definition. Mawlana al-Tahtawi disagrees. And Mawlana al-Tahtawi is correct here. And this is something discussed in the commentaries on the Manar and elsewhere. That what's the relationship between ada and qada? And Tahtawi's summary here is very good, that there are three states. There's ada, qada, and i'ada. Right? So in the things that relate to time, yani ada is taslimu ayn al-wajib yani fi waqtihi. Right? 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 And qada is to so ada, a current performance, is to fulfill what was the obligation itself in its time. Qada is taslimu ayn al-wajib ba'da khuruj al-waqt. Qada is to discharge that which is obligatory after its time. And this is mentioned in usul. Al-qada yajib bima yajibu bihi al-ada. Qada is due with that which the ada was due, which is the amr. A command is established from it. There's a wajib, there's a haqq, there's something enters your dhimma. If you discharge what is in your dhimma, in your dues, within the time, that is ada. If you discharge it after its time, it's called qada. But what are you discharging? The same thing due. That's a stronger opinion. Right? And this is and there's a good discussion. And so that's ada and qada. And i'ada, right? And he also gives a definition for i'ada, right? Of repetition, repeating, right? Right? I'ada, right, is performing the wajib. The wajib here meaning the thing that was due again, right? Is performing the wajib again لخلل فيه لرفع خلل فيه, in order to lift some deficiency in it. Right? كل صلاة أديت مع كراهة التحريم فسبيلها الإعادة. Every prayer performed with كراهة التحريم, it's what فيجب فيها الإعادة. Repeating it. Now it's important to have consistency in your English fiqh language. So there's the idea of the makeup and there's the idea of the repetition. Repeating the prayer, like if someone prayed dhuhr and they did not perform the first sitting, for sure. They said, it's not obligatory. So they didn't do it. They're like, oh my goodness, but it's wajib. They got confused in their fiqh. Right? So when did the ada happen? When they prayed their dhuhr. It was ada. They did it. Taslimul wajib fil waqt. They did what was obligatory within the time. They've done it. But they've done it ala wajhi naqs. Now if they were to die, so Uncle Jamil did his dhuhr, he got confused. Because their teacher, right? Not Zain Lutfi Zada, he went to Zain Shiddat Zada. And Zain Shiddat Zada made things very complicated. Uncle Jamil got confused. He gave his salams, he had a massive heart attack and he died. On the Day of Judgment, would he be judged as though as a person who left that prayer? لا, because he did the obligatory, he left the wajib. But there's the naqs. Had Uncle Jamil lived on, if he prayed dhuhr again, this is considered i'ada, right? You're doing the wajib again. The ada happened with the first one. The i'ada, you intend the fard, but yaqa'u naflan, but it counts as a nafl, right? But it lifts the deficiency. It lifts the deficiency, right? Right? And of course, qada on its own is not sufficient for missing a prayer. And a lot of people are negligent of this, right? Leaving a prayer, even one, is a kabira, right? And Imam Tahtawi has a good discussion on that. He says, وَالتَّأْخِيرُ بِلَا عُذْرٍ كَبِيرًا, leaving a prayer without an excuse. Yeah, leaving a prayer, even delaying a prayer, meaning عن وقتها. والتأخير أي تأخير الصلاة عن وقتها, right? Delaying a prayer beyond its time without excuse, and without an excuse that permits بلا عذر مقبول, is a major sin. That is not the sin is not lifted by the qada, بل بالتوبة, but rather with tawbah, أو الحج, or by الحج المبرور, right? على خلاف فيه, right? And he has a nice discussion on that, and he gives a definition of i'ada. Those are very important, right? And it's worth reading that whole section. It's very important. Okay. And here you could do well. When we looked at in usul al-fiqh, the amr, there's ada and qada, and we touched upon it just lightly, but we did touch upon it. It's good to make cross references there, but then you find use, like Imam Tahtawi, his summary here is like it's spot on, basically. It's very, very solid. Rahmatullahi alayhi. I don't know how much of that is there in any of the. Which one are you using? And what's that? Yeah. It shouldn't do things like that with your books. The book was like, if the book could complain, the book would be complaining against you, because books have rights, and books are mu'azzam. Now there's collateral damage that happens to books without you doing anything. That may be excused. Like, I try not to brutalize my books, but I do use them, so they, things fall apart and so on, even when you don't try to ruin them, partly because just they publish badly. But Sheikh Abdul Fattah would say, like, from dhulm to the book is to leave a pen within it. Now, sometimes dhulm can be excused, just like what Sheikh Ali does with his books. See his books look like they've been through jihad and back and again. It's like the shaheed. They wish they could go back to earth and be martyred again, and go back and be martyred again, right? But if you're doing what Sheikh Ali is doing, then it's okay, because his books have all these arrows within and between lines, and he's circled, like, and half his books have, like, what his main tafasir are, just by seeing the ones that are bandaged and broken and falling apart. But هذا خلاف الأصل. الحمد لله. فالترتيب بين الفائتة. So he says الترتيب بين الفائتة والوقتية وبين الفوائد مستحق. So the matan, the order between a missed prayer and the prayer of the time, and between multiple missed prayers, is required. It's a fard amali. It's operationally obligatory. Right? الترتيب بين الفائتة القليلة وهي ما دون 6 صلوات وبين الوقتية المتسع وقتها مع تذكر الفائتة لازم، أي فرض عملي. وكذا الترتيب بين نفس الفوائت القليلة مستحق، أي لازم، لأنه فرض عملي يفوت الجواز بفوته. So the order between a missed prayer, which is of limited number, which is 6 or less, and between the prayer of the time, if there is enough time while and one remembers the missed prayer, is required, right? And likewise, the order between the missed prayers themselves, if they're few in number, which is 6 or less, is due, is incumbent, meaning required, because it is operationally obligatory. It's a fard amali. And he gives us a definition of the fard amali in its description, right? Such that permissibility is lifted by its vitiation. This is of the numerous things. It's one of those verses that are أمهات آيات الأحكام. إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا. Right? The inna is for ta'keed. إن الصلاة كانت is indeed. على المؤمنين is for اشتراط. That it. كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا. كتابا أي مقدرة بأوقات. Right? And indeed prayer has been made incumbent upon the believers in duly apportioned times. فلا تصح صلاة قبل وقتها ولا تجوز بعد وقتها. Right? ولكل صلاة وقت. Right? And each prayer has a time. يعني فتأتي بعد الذي قبلها وقبل التي بعدها. So each prayer has a time, so that's duly apportioned. موقوتة, duly apportioned. So each prayer has its time, but it's the as-salah, which is all the prayers, right, are duly apportioned. So each prayer has its time, but it comes after the one before it, and it comes before the one after it. That is all in that verse, right? It's all in that verse. Now, sometimes, we have our usul, right? Sometimes when you want to show, okay, what is our reasoning for this? You have to appreciate that the Department of Defense, right, is just there to protect the temple from the enemies, protect the castle from the enemies, right? They don't, the guards at the gate don't really care what's going on inside in itself. They're not responsible for anything inside. They just stand at the gate. So at the gate, we have to be able to say, okay, what is our textual evidence? i.e., what is the evidence from the hadith? That's the battleground of ikhtilaf, right? Where's your specific hadith versus our specific hadith? But in itself, to understand the madhab, understand the foundation of the Hanafi madhab, the foundation of the Hanafi madhab is ala al-qat'iyat. Ala al-qat'iyat. And sometimes you test some, not test them, but just open a conversation that why do we say this? It says, you know, there's a hadith in Daraqutni. That's just where having a conversation with the Shafi'is, they give them something that hopefully they'll say, okay, we'll leave you alone. But you have to appreciate what is the foundation of our own madhab first, and then there's secondary evidence. And that's where, you know, not to get lost in all the legalese, but the core issues, that's where things like, you know, like bada'i', sana'i', etc., even if one dips on core issues, one finds a lot of insight. Someone asked one of the mashayikh that what is the best book of hadith of the ayat al-ahkam in the Hanafi school, and he said shuruh al-madhab is the commentaries on the madhab. Why? Because you want to understand how Hanafis understand the Quran, read the Quran, but keep in mind what the fuqaha state, because the ta'lilat, the reasonings that they give, where are they from? Okay, it's from the ayat Qur'aniyah. Okay? But you have to, one, read the Quran, right? That should be your sahib. You want, what's the best thing to help you with your understanding of aqidah? The Quran. You want the best companion to understand your fiqh is the Quran, right? So here this order is understood from the from there. Number one, but because this is mustanbat, it is this dalil is ظني في أصله ارتقى مدلوله يعني بالشواهد والاعتبارات حتى ارتقى إلى حيز الفرض. So the فرض عملي is in of itself established by a text that would establish the wajib, right? A text that would establish the wajib. In this case, you know, the Quranic verse, Hanafis might not put it this way necessarily, but say, which is قطعي الثبوت. ودلالته قابلة لشيء من الظنية. Like they're much closer. That and its indication, though we see it as very strong, accepts the admission of some element of being dhanni. We're not going to say dhanni. Khalas, if we say dhanni, our argument stops, right? Largely. Accept something of dhanni, but we'll be fair. Say it's required, but it's not quite fard, but almost, right? So the element there, it's not 100%. Say, yeah, it's 98. So do you have to do it? You better. Is there that little element? You have to say, is it required or not? No, it's required. Now, above and beyond the plain vanilla fard, the plain vanilla wajib, the higher level of wajib, the basic wajib, if left, the action is, if you leave a wajib, what's the ruling of the action?
Sound, but deficient.
Yeah, it's valid but deficient, right? It's العمل صحيح لكنه ناقص نقصا يجب جبره, right? It's a deficiency that needs to be corrected, right? But the higher level of wajib, it's nearly fard, right? So it's operationally fard, it's fard amali. So the definition of the fard amali is given by Imam al-Shurunbulali in passing. They define al-fard al-amali huwa ma yafutu al-jawazu bifawtihi. Right? So al-fard al-amali huwa a'la naw'i al-wajib. It's the higher of the two types of wajib. It's not just a plain vanilla wajib though. It's a wajib that if omitted, the validity is compromised. How is it compromised? It can differ in different places. Now sometimes the ulama won't necessarily go into certain things being fard amali, because there's no implication to it. Because the action, in some maqadir, some limits, in itself a limit is needed. Now this limit, the text of it is originally, so a limit is known in the Sharia. There has to be some extent. This extent is understood ijtihadan. But the mujtahid considers it almost qat'i. Almost qat'i. So they admit that does it accept interpretive possibility? Yeah. Such as what? What are a whole bunch of things in wudu that we've discussed are fard amali, quarter the head. Right? But that's also a danger of some of the modern books of Ayat al-Ahkam. They say, well, the Hanafi said this, the Shafi'i said this. This looks like what's called fiqh al-cocktail. Put in whatever flavors, blend them up. He says, no. Why did the Hanafis consider quarter? So it's just like they had some consider. No, right? No. The Hanafi ulama have usul, have principles of interpretation. They come to the primary texts with these tools. So this is the text, and this, here's the text, and here are the rulings. To get from text to rulings, you need principles. Right? Now, if you apply the Hanafi principles to the ayat al-Tahara, when it comes to وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ, you would come to the conclusion that a defined amount of the head is required to wipe. Whether we understand that as being a quarter or qadr al-nasiya or the muqaddam, it's essentially the same. Right? And so on. So that's the that's the usuli Hanafi approach. And many of the commentaries point to that, Tabeen al-Haqa'iq and others. And there's a Hadithi Hanafi approach, also good. Right? Mullah Ali al-Qari does that. He said the ayah is mujmala, the Sunnah explains it. That's the easy way of explaining it, but the former is more rigorous. So same thing applies here. Okay. والأصل في لزوم الترتيب قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم من نام عن صلاة أو نسيها فلم يذكرها إلا وهو يصلي مع الإمام فليصلي التي هو فيها ليقضي التي ثم ليقضي الذي تذكرها ثم ليعد التي صلى مع الإمام. Right? Because of this hadith. And these are, the first part is a well-established hadith. Whoever sleeps through a prayer or forgets it and that does not remember it except while they're praying with the imam, then let them pray it first. Right? Let them, falyus. So let them pray the one they're praying, that they're in, and then make up the one that they remembered, and then repeat the one that they were praying with the imam. So this hadith is problematic, right? It's problematic in a sense that fil marfu', it's narrated from ad-Daraqutni. What do you have as a reference?
He says لما عثر عليه بهذا اللفظ وأخرج البيهقي في الكبرى نحوه.
أخرج البيهقي what?
في الكبرى نحوه.
أخرج
البيهقي في الكبرى نحوه.
No. Okay. That's why you can't trust any of these takhrijs. They're all generally as shoddy as each other, sadly. Others reference this hadith to ad-Daraqutni. If you actually go and look at it, all of them have significantly distinct wording to this. And it's not giving the hadith its due, right? Okay. وهو خبر مشهور تلقته العلماء بالقبول. This is a widespread narration, right? That the ulama accepted. The ulama accepted. فيثبت به الفرض العملي. So the fard al-amali is established by it. Right? ورتب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قضاء الفوائد يوم الخندق. And the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, this of course, this دلالة الفعل is weaker than the دلالة العمل. But the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم made up his prayers in order when they missed the prayers due to battle, during the Ghazwat al-Khandaq, the battle of the trench. So we don't need to worry too much right now about the text itself, etc. But if you actually go, so Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam has some issues with deeming the hadith mashhur, right? But then there's a bigger argument, right, amongst it, that depends on what usage you're using for the term mashhur, right? Because the early Hanafi usage of mashhur, of widespread hadith, would encompass not only what is marfu' from the Prophet ﷺ, the muttasil, right, would also include the munqati', which include the mursal, but also the mawquf ala sahaba, right? So you consider all of those together, would be considered mashhur, right? So there are a number of issues where Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam, though he's taken as a great authority when it comes to Hanafi legal reasoning and also the textual bases of the Hanafi school, but these are the things that his position has been disputed. And generally, Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam is more precise than al-Zayla'i in hitting the evidence on its head kind of thing. But here, both al-Zayla'i and others, Al-Aini in the Binaya and others, do more justice to this issue, and the earlier works as well, they go into it. But simply, there are many athar about at-tartib fil qada, right? But stronger than that is a primary textual basis being the Quranic verse, but also more broadly, what is the asl when it comes to awqat as-salah, right? The asl, and we talked about some of the usul when we looked at the awqat as-salah. And those works like the Bada'i' have brilliant discussion on that, and that's something that you guys could maybe review together and see what you find. I'd be kind of keen to see what you find. Okay, then he says, so the order is required to observe. Then we'll look at what lifts it and continue from there, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But we've taken a few important things today. One is the requirement of qada. Now you can self-test by saying, okay, if someone comes up to you in the masjid and say, oh, are you a talib ilm? You say, alhamdulillah. So, beta, I heard that you don't have to make up missed prayers. Or be quick because I need to pray my nafil namaz. Right? Can you give a brief, sound, coherent answer? Of course, sometimes the answer is yes. Right? And so you just have to practice is giving, one of the best answers you can give is to speak with certainty. Okay? Try to smile when you can. And sometimes all you need, like sometimes you're ready. I want to give, I have 5 reasons to give, I'm going to convince you. It says, yes, it's required. Says, oh, then I'll do it. And that's it. Sometimes don't underestimate. People ask because they want an answer. Okay? And very often, it's not just giving the proof that is needed. Often you need to convince them. Right? And there's that also, that's called the dalil iqna'i. Right? That you could argue from now till the cows get slaughtered about machine slaughtered versus hand slaughtered. Right? I don't like arguments because frankly they're rarely won. Right? So in our own family, etc., we came back, simplest argument, rather than saying machine slaughtered, hand slaughtered, give people a practical solution. People want religion that works. Okay? So we just found out, okay, what are good halal butchers in Mississauga that are hand slaughtered, but it's nice and clean and they're good prices. So there's a number of hand slaughtered places that are really good, and there's one close to your place. And always when one has a choice, isn't it just better to be safe? Say, yeah, beta, makes sense. And they're surprised because they're expecting you're going to put up a fight, and you don't. You just give a practical solution, they'll follow it. Right? And you see that usloob in the Prophet ﷺ so often. That's also called al-jawab al-hakim, the wise response. But there's a time for a wise response, sometimes there's a time for a legal answer. But one does not necessarily preclude the other. Mata sa'a, when's the final hour? And did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about its ashrat, and the Prophet ﷺ tells us about its alamat and so on, and we know them, the kubra and the sughra and the wusta, etc., of the alamat as-sa'a. He asked him, ma a'datta laha, what have you prepared for it? So similarly, in many of these sensitive things, we need to be able to give both the convincing reasoning, but also the practical solution. It makes sense. It's safer to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with one's dues clear, and once you repent, the sin is lifted, but the right remains due. And if you are taking consistent means to discharge your due, and even if you were to die, the hope is Allah will clear it. But if you owe a debt and you're not taking the means to fulfill it, then one's not in a good situation. That makes sense. Okay. Bismillah. So these are the issues that a lot of people have ibtila with, but it's not the first time in their ummah that people have had struggles. People have struggled with religion and practice throughout history. But it's something that needs attention, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So we'll stop there. And then the definitions of ada, qada, i'ada, current performance, qada, i'ada, that's good. There's a separate issue of, he goes into a digression of ada kamil and ada qasir, ada shabih bil qada. That's an extra detail. We actually took it in usul. So sometimes they put things like this ikhtibarul athkiya. That okay, if you've done usul, you should be familiar with, but here goes. But it's a self-test that okay, see ada is kamil, qasir, and shabih bil ada. This came up in usul. So forget what Tahtawi says for a moment. Do I recall what I covered in Mukhtasar al-Manar at level 2? If you don't, it's okay. I got a review. The answer to most ilm challenges is, I got a review. Bi'idhnillah. of the many books that a talib ilm should either read or dip into, and it makes for a very good dip, is a wonderful work by Ibn al-Jawzi called Sayyidul Khatir. And it's nice because they're like bite-sized. Once in a while he goes off on rants on different things. Sometimes he's just upset and he had to write down something. And sometimes they're cute. Sometimes he's complaining about the ulama of his time or about this or that. He has different things to say about aqidah, some very good and some like whatever. But of the most precious of the Sayyid al-Khawatir are those related to ilm, and especially on to talab al-ilm. They're amazing. If you have Safahat min Sabr al-Ulama and Qimat al-Zaman, you can, Shaykh Abdul Fattah is of those who, rahmatullahi alayhi, who really did excellent indexes. And one of the people worth just reading the entries of his is Ibn al-Jawzi. Interesting, first Ibn al-Jawzi did a mukhtasar of what? Of Ihya Ulumuddin. And he's very critical of Imam al-Ghazali when it comes to his use of very weak hadiths. But he, in his own books, fell into the same thing. Ibn al-Jawzi wrote spectacularly good books in wa'az. Spectacularly good books. But the same thing he criticized Imam al-Ghazali for, you find that there. But al-wa'az there's a certain amount of tawassu' in it. That you see Mukhtasar Minhaj al-Qasidin is frequently used as one of the abridgments of the Ihya, and of course and Minhaj al-Qasidin itself. But Ibn al-Jawzi has many important works. But as Sayyid al-Khatir, he writes beautifully too. It's very nice. Someone took just the advice on talab al-ilm and put it as talab al-ilm inda Ibn al-Jawzi, etc. Sometimes those are useful, but it's better to go to the original source, right? Because sometimes, especially 20th century authors, and especially a lot of the publishing funding comes from certain places, they're selective in what they'll quote, right? So you get an impression about him that's different from what's real, right? Especially anyone Hanbali in any way, right? So Ibn al-Jawzi, for example, he actually wrote a very important work on tanzih called Daf' Shubah al-Tashbih. It's actually translated into English by Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamid Ali, right? And very good explanation of the ayat al-mutashabihat, etc., etc., etc. And he was a non-anthropomorphic Hanbali. And he was very critical of the Hanabila for that, but at the same time he was critical of the Ash'aris because he's Hanbali. But the Sayyid al-Khatir is very, very good. And has many other things. Ulu al-himma, talab al-ilm, etc. And there's an edition that was, I'm not sure if it was edited by Sheikh Tantawi, or there's a foreword by Sheikh Tantawi, but that's a better one. There are some really annoying ones, and probably just save yourself a headache and just distinguish. Some of them, like, they'll say he rahimahullah was away from the aqeedah of the salaf and this that. Like, just get a decent edition and save yourself headaches. Any other questions?